poetry, which means I've got to completely change gears. Poetry 5. Pages 589 to 620 something in our book. I'm just making sure. I didn't send a video for Thursday right? The video I sent was to finish Hamlet, just making sure. Because I picked up a bug or something and between my car and this bug, canceled classes Friday and then yesterday. So, page 589, the 11th edition, the first part, beginning poetry. The reason I put this section last, it's middle part in your book. The reason I put it last is this is usually the part of an intro to lit course that everybody hates the most. Nobody likes talking about poetry. Almost nobody likes to read poetry. But you all listen to it daily. If you listen to songs with words, you're listening to poetry. And that's why, the beginning part of this, perhaps the best way to begin reading poetry responsibly is to not allow yourself to be intimidated by it. Look at everything we will read and discuss as being similar to your experience of a song, radio, CD, whatever, okay, Spotify and such, okay? Just listen to it. And to do that, usually the best way to do it is to read it aloud. Even if you don't think you understand what's called the meter and the rhyme and all that, don't worry about that. Just read the words and listen to them aloud. If it has rhyme, your ear's going to pick up on the rhyme and you will notice that very quickly, okay? So the stuff that he says there on the beginning page about reading poetry and listening to it and such. So I want to turn our attention very quickly, first poem. It's not on the assigned readings for the syllabus, but as I said the first day of class, and we've done some, since then, everything that's discussed in class can show up on a quiz or exam. So everything from here for the remaining 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, whatever it is, any poem that's discussed can be on the final exam or can show up on a quiz. This one, I will guarantee you, it does show up. Can't remember where, author title usually. But we're going to look at the short poem on page 591 by Robert Hayden, Those Winter Sundays. It's a short poem. There's 3 stanzas, 5, 4, and 5, 14 lines. Not quite a sonnet structure-wise, but it still works. We'll talk about sonnet and poem structure and such later. Just listen to the poem, and then we'll spend a couple minutes talking about it and getting a feel for how poetry works. We're not going to talk about rhyme. We're not going to talk about meter or anything. We're just talk about the words and the meaning of the words. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? So, notice what we're told. First word, we get a time frame. It's a setting, so to speak. Poems can have settings, just like plays can have settings, or novels can have settings. So this is Sundays 2. What does the 2 mean? T-O-O. Also. So everything that comes after that implies the Father does it more than just on Sundays. It happens on the other days of the week, or at least most of it does. Sundays too, my father, and notice how I read this. Sundays too, my father got up early. That's end of line 1, line 2, and put his clothes on in the blue, black, cold. But there's no mark of punctuation after early. So what the poet intends, usually when that happens, is for that first line to be read right on to the second line. So it sounds like, Sundays too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue, black, cold, comma, pause, take a breath. Then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. Period. Take a long breath, because that's 2.5 lines. All right? So, what does the father do? On Sundays and every day of the week, it implies. Gets up early. What does it mean? Puts his clothes on in the blue, black, cold. How can cold be a color? Depends on how cold it is.
If it's early, it's probably dark.
It's dark. It's the blue, black, cold. It's not the black cold. What's the difference? It's not 3 a.m. 3 a.m., it's pitch black outside. Blue, black, cold, the sun is approaching the horizon. You're starting to get that faint lightning in the east, okay? And then with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. What does he do for a living? An accountant, right? Lawyer, doctor, professor. Blue collar, working where? I don't mean where like a firm or company. I mean where, location. From labor in the weekday weather. He works outside. Okay? That's why his hands are cracked and ache. They're cracked from working in the sun. They're cracked from working in harsh conditions. Okay? Before I started graduate school and stuff, during the 70s, my dad had a lawn business. Admittedly, this was north central California, so the weather wasn't like here or in the Northeast, but there were mornings, got up and it was 30s and having to go start the equipment, all that kind of stuff. Hands would get sore after a while. And then when I worked for a mason here in 1985, January of 1985 was the coldest weather in Tennessee on record. Okay? This was on Lookout Mountain, just over the border from Chattanooga. And for 3 straight days on Lookout Mountain, we didn't get above 0. Okay? I was working for a mason at the time. We still worked because we had jobs down in Chattanooga, which meant I was, we'd go down to the site and I'd start mixing mortar and 10, 15 degrees, putting in antifreeze to be able to mix the mortar so that the water wouldn't freeze and stuff. Hands would get very, very sore and tired from that. So, hands that ache from labor in the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. What's a banked fire? Anybody know? Have you ever been to a bonfire? Like an overnight bonfire? Okay. Beaches are the best place to have these. What happens if we were to bring in a bunch of wood, start a fire right here, and let it burn? I mean, big fire. If we came in tomorrow, would that be cold? No. If we were to come in tomorrow and I said, put your hand in there, you'd be a damn fool to put your hand in there because your hand would burn. Because underneath all that ash, Shakespeare is going to use this image for a sonnet later on that we'll read. Underneath all that ash are going to be red, glowing embers. That's what banked fires are. Banked fires is talking about a wood stove, usually not a fireplace, a wood stove where you build up the fire before you go to bed. You shut down what's called the damper so you don't get a lot of airflow, and the fire just kind of burns at a slow, steady pace. And in the morning, you shake the grate, the ash settles down beneath it, you've got the glowing red embers, You put kindling, and the fire blazes up. It's telling us something about the house they live in. There's no central heat and air. Okay? Again, personal experience. We put in a wood stove in our house in something like 72. We did have some gas heat, but it wasn't enough to heat us. This was a 900 square foot house for 7 people. And, you know, it was often either I or my older brother's job first thing in the morning during the winter to get that ash out and reheat or build up the fire that was at that point nearly dead. It was only embers in the stove. From labor in the weekday weather made banked fires blaze. So this is what the father does seemingly every day of the week. Gets up early when it's still dark, okay, and warms up the house. What does the next sentence do? No one ever thanked him. Who's the no one? The speaker, obviously, as well as other members of the family. Second stanza. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. How does cold splinter and break? I'll give you an example. In 1985, my wife and I were married in May of 84. I lived in a cabin that was built in the 1940s on Lookout Mountain for summer visitors. And if you look at this building, you look at the walls here, you got concrete block. Between concrete block, you've got this layer of mortar. In a log house, that's called chinking, okay? So you have a log, and then you have chinking, a layer of mortar, and then a log on top. Well, because this cabin was 40 years old at least, a lot of the chinking was missing. So I moved in like December. I stapled blankets up over that. Again, January 85, coldest toilet. Both the tank and the bowl froze solid in the house, in the cabin. But when the wind would blow outside in a big storm, those blankets would do this, wave back and forth, because that's how much air was moving. I had a wood stove, and I would get that sucker, I'm not kidding, I would get that thing glowing. I mean, it's cast iron, it would glow red. And as it heated up, if you were quiet in there, you could listen to that wood of the logs cracking. Why? What happens? Heat does what to stuff? Makes it expand. And that's the sound of it expanding. It gets cold and it shrinks back down again. The house is doing that. Okay? When the rooms were warm, he'd call. And slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. Notice that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines before you get to the terminal punctuation. So you just take a pause after each of those comments, even though you're going from one stanza to a new stanza. So, when the rooms were warm, he'd call. Why? He doesn't want people to get up when it's cold. Okay? Slowly I would rise and dress. Why would the speaker slowly rise? Tired. Getting out from under nice warm blankets. And while the house is warmer, it's not as warm as the heat you generate under a bunch of blankets. 98.6, nice and snug. Slowly I would rise and dress. The next line tells us it's not the reason I just gave. It's not because I'm nice and warm under that blanket. Fearing the chronic angers of that house. That is why the person takes time to get up. How can a house have... Shut up. Siri, go away. Why would a house have chronic anger? Notice that's metaphor. Houses don't have anger or joy. fearing the chronic angers of that house, comma, speaking indifferently to him, comma. What is speaking indifferently to the Father? Go back for a second. Line 5, 6, 7, 8, 8. Slowly I would rise and dress, comma, fearing the chronic angers of that house. That modifies the I, comma, speaking indifferently to him.
Would it be the people in the house?
Could be. The speaking indifferently to him could be the people, but there's not a pronoun or something like that immediately there that would indicate that it's there is a pronoun, but there's not a plural one indicating that it's the people in the house. The speaking indifferently could refer to the chronic angers, but that doesn't make sense. Or does it go back like fearing the chronic angers of that house, the I? See, fearing the chronic angers of the house and speaking indifferently to him, they're both the same part of speech. They're a participial phrase. Participial phrases refer back or modify the subject. The subject of that part is I. I would slowly rise and dress. Why slowly? Because I fear the chronic angers of that house. Why else? Speaking indifferently to him. Is the speaker the one doing the speaking indifferently? Who had driven out the cold and polished my gray shoes as well. So I get up slowly, fearing the chronic angers of that house. Noticing there's not an and speaking indifferently to him. But I think that's what is implied. In the speaker of the poem, the persona, what that person is also called, would speak indifferently to the Father. What does it mean indifferently?
Without emotion.
Okay, say that again.
Without emotion.
Is it without emotion? Or is there an emotion that's not loudly expressed? A subtle emotion. If you're talking to somebody about something and you're trying to get approval, let's say, of some kind, and the person thinks you shouldn't do something, and you just kind of keep pressing. If this person's, just whatever. What does that mean? I don't give a damn. That's what it means to be speaking indifferently. It's like the Father tries to engage in a conversation and the speaker, whatever. Okay? Assuming for a moment you have children. When your kids get to be teens, especially early teens, 14, 15, 13, you'll understand what this is talking about. All mine are in their 20s and 30s. Speaking indifferently to him who had driven out the cold. Why does the speaker emphasize that? And polished my good shoes as well. Why are we told that again that the Father had driven out the cold? What act does that show on the part of the Father? It's an act of love. Father didn't have to do that. He could have woken everybody up at the same time. Let them all suffer the cold. He does that not just Sundays, every day of the week. Why? So that children, wife, don't have to get up in the cold. And also done what? With hands that ache from labor in the weekday weather. Polished the good shoes. Not only starts the fire, but polishes the speaker's shoes. Do we know anything about the sex of the speaker? I don't like the word gender, so I don't use it. Is the speaker male or female? What did I know What did I know? Why is it repeated? What did I know of? What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? What's the speaker saying? Notice the tense. What did I know? Did when? Back then. Notice the speaker does not say, what do I know? Why? Because the did implies that there's a change between the past, back then, and now. So what's the speaker saying? Say that louder.
Is that they're reflecting?
Okay, keep going. I think you're right. You're close to a fuller answer. You're not wrong. Let me put it that way. So the speaker's reflecting on it. Why? Why do you usually reflect on something? Because of what's happening now. What's the speaker saying about the now? Now, what? I know of love's austere and lonely offices. How does the speaker know that? We still don't know the sex of the speaker, but I think it's implied. My own reading, and it's probably because I'm a father, the speaker is male. And the speaker is saying, I now know exactly what my father did. I now know exactly what it's, and not just the caring, the doing things to warm up the house and everything, but getting the what in response. F you, or the whatever. The lack of a reciprocal kind of attitude. And notice the term that's used to describe the father's actions. Loves, skip the next two adjectives. Adverbs. Loves offices. What's meant by offices?
Okay,
It's not a place where you go to work. The offices is referring to, who would sign that? Have her sign it too. You know, you have committees, and you have what are called ex officio members. These are members who are members of that committee by duty of their positions. It's not the office, so to speak. It's the duties that they have. Love's austere and lonely offices are referring to the duties of love. And they're austere, why? Because you don't get paid for them. You don't get any kind of bonus, so to speak. They're what you do because of who you are, in this case, a father, okay? So we've just spent, 10 minutes, maybe a little bit longer? They've already signed it. Just bring it on up when you have a minute. Showing how that poem works. And notice the series of questions that you get. Does the poem match the feeling you have about winter Sundays? Well, part of that would depend upon where you were raised. If you're from Miami, you're not going to understand this no matter what. Well, you might understand it, if you were a father, but you're not going to understand what's it like to grow up to wake up in a cold home, so to speak, okay? So, when you first read it, notice if you read that, you probably didn't unpack all that meaning the first time. This is why it's necessary, really, and most of the poems we're going to be reading, most of them are relatively short. There's only two that are fairly long, Ode on a Grecian Urn and Ode on a West Wind. The others are 50 lines, most of them 50 lines or less. One or two more might be about 100 lines. It's necessary to read them multiple times. And again, read them aloud, read them according to the punctuation. Where there's a comma, take a short pause. A semicolon, take a longer pause. A period, take a longer pause, all right? So, look at the poem on the next page, 592. dog's death. And I'll warn you right now, if you're an animal lover and you've had dogs and you've had a dog recently die, you can leave right now. I mean, this poem will bring you to tears. First time I taught this, I literally had our dog that we had from a puppy, our other dog gave birth to it, die in my arms that morning before class. And this was a big dog, okay? Big dogs, more love, all that kind of nonsense. Dog's Death by John Updike. So both of these may show up on a quiz or the exam. She must have been kicked unseen or brushed by a car. Well, that's, short, sweet, declarative. Either kicked or hit by a car. Too young to know much, she was beginning to learn to use the newspaper spread on the kitchen floor and to win, wedding there the words, "Good dog, good dog." So, how old is this dog? Just a puppy. We thought her shy malaise was a shot reaction. Like, this dog is really young, probably 8 weeks. When you first get a puppy, you get it shots. The autopsy disclosed a rupture in her liver. Again, short, simple, declarative. As we teased her with play, blood was filling her skin and her heart was learning to lie down forever. Notice what the poet there, how the poet inverts time. Okay? She must have been kicked or brushed by a car. This is at some point in the past. She was beginning to learn how to use the papers, to be house trained. And to win, wedding there, good dog, good dog. We thought the reaction was the malaise was a shot reaction. The autopsy, you cut it open and figure out what's the cause of death. And then we go back to prior to the death, as we teased her with play, what? Her blood was filling her skin, internal bleeding. So the dog, is still trying to play while it's dying. Monday morning, as the children were noisily fed and sent to school, she crawled beneath the youngest bed. We found her twisted and limp, but still alive. In the car to the vet's on my lap, she tried to bite my hand and died. Notice tried, died, the rhyme is in the middle of the line rather than at the end. I stroked her warm fur, and my wife called in a voice imperious with tears. Called, not called like on a cell phone, because this is before then. This is called to the dog. Don't stay with us, Though surrounded by love that would have upheld her, nevertheless she sank and stiffening disappeared. Notice, not surrounded by the entire family, but by the husband and wife in the car. Back home, we found that in the night, her frame drawing near to dissolution, that is, she was going the way, the phrase is, the way of all flesh, dying, had endured the shame of diarrhea. So the dog's dying, and the dog has diarrhea, and had dragged across the floor to a newspaper carelessly left there. This is not the paper left out for the house training. This is the paper, and the dog is literally dying. And it sees the paper, it knows it's got diarrhea, and it crawls, and you get good dog. Why? Because it died? No. And it's dying throes. What's that poem designed to do? Make you depressed? That's one way of putting it. It is a sentimental poem. It is designed to grab those heartstrings and just pull, to elicit an emotional response. Those winter Sundays, possibly, it's more reflective, it's more meditative. This is designed to make you cry. And unless you're a cold-hearted son of a, most people get somewhat affected by that, okay? I've literally done this and had students get up and leave. Not when I told them to, but, and then came back afterwards and, said why, okay? Notice, that poem doesn't have a lot of deep, significant meaning that you have to tease out like we did with those winter Sundays. It's fairly simple, it's fairly straightforward. Those winter Sundays, you get a lot more packed. See, that's one of the things poems do. William Faulkner, Barn Burning, that we read by him, he said he was a novelist because he wasn't a poet. He wanted to be a poet. And he said, poets say the most with the least. They say the most meaning with the least number of words. Novelists just, I don't want to say novelists are the opposite. They say the least with the most words, but they take a lot of words to get their point of, and what poets do is they encapsulate, they distill that meaning down into the fewest words possible, okay? So one of the things you see in poetry is this play. You play with words, you play with the meaning of words. And because of that, unlike dramas, the 4 plays we read, and unlike short stories, the short stories and such, and novels, you get much more ambiguity in a poem. It's like what poets do is they want you to read the poem and go, huh? Novelists don't. They don't want you to go, huh? They want you to have an experience and to enjoy, to get angry, etc. Poets kind of want to tickle your brain and make you, well, what does that mean? When you look at the little poem down at the bottom of 593, which you all know because you've all heard it or said it, I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream, that's just playful. It's only designed to repeat sounds, okay? And because who doesn't like ice cream, okay? So, go to, let's see, do I want to do it this way or not? Yeah, I'm going to go through a bunch of pages and point out several of the bolded terms. We're going to do that quickly. So, for example, in 596, you've got paraphrase mentioned. You all know what a paraphrase is. So I'm not going to say much about it. You put those words of the poem into your own words. We did that when we talked about, that's pretty much what I do throughout the class. Okay? So, turn again to 603. Wait, do I want to do that? 602, 603. 602, verse. Okay? Verse refers to lines that have a measured rhythm to them and a measured rhyme to them also. Rhythmical pattern refers to a pattern of stressed or accented and unaccented syllables. Here's an example one, iambic pentameter. When we get to Shakespeare's sonnets are usually written in what's called iambic pentameter. You get a stress, unstress syllable. Ba-bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. And there are 10 of those syllables. That's the pentameter. Pentameter. Meter refers to a stressed and unstressed syllable. We'll talk about that a little bit later. Okay? 603, theme. It's the same thing as for short stories and for novels. It's the main idea. Okay? I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. What's the theme? Ice cream, man. You like ice cream. Okay? It's pretty clear. Those winter Sundays, it's a little more difficult. The theme there is recollection of the past, reflection on what a horrible child I was for not thanking my father for doing all these things for me. There could be a bunch, all right? 604, lyric, okay? A poem that expresses the emotions and thoughts of a single speaker. Those winter Sundays is lyrical. What did I know? What did I know? That's expressing emotion. That's expressing regret. Okay, of love's lonely and austere offices. Narrative poem down at the bottom of the page. A poem that tells a story is a narrative poem. A really, really long narrative poem is an epic. John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is not this long. It's a poem written in multiple books. We would call them kind of chapters. But it's several thousand lines long. Okay? The Old English epic poem, Beowulf, same kind of thing. Okay? An epic is a poem, your gloss tells you, serious subject chronicling heroic deeds, important events, founders of countries, etc. Then, 606 and 607. You got suggestions for approaching poetry. And what's meant by that is have these questions and comments in mind as you read the poem. So, for example, assume you're going to need to read it more than once, other than doggerel things like I scream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream. Okay? You're going to have to read it more than once in order to figure it out or to get beyond the surface level meaning. Okay? Titles. Titles are always important. Notice it's those winter Sundays. It's not, regrets of a child. Why? Because the speaker takes the Sundays as being the important part. Because not only did the father get up all those days of the week, but on Sunday mornings he polished my shoes. Implication is for church. Okay? Read the poem aloud. If you don't know the meaning of a word, look it up. Follow the punctuation. Okay? Paraphrase it. If you can put it in your own words, then you understand it. If you can't, you don't. What I used to tell students, I haven't had many come to me to ask me about, going in and teaching all that recently, but I would always tell them, especially those who were working on their PhD or something, and they were just kind of starting to teach, I'd tell them, you don't know something until you have to teach it. If you become a tutor for somebody, you don't really know that material, if math, whatever, until you have to explain the concepts to somebody else. Because you're going to get questions like a 2-year-old. I'm not implying college students are 2-year-olds, but you're often going to get the why, until you get down to the foundation of whatever the topic is. Okay? Try to get a sense of who is speaking. So I suggested that the speaker behind those winter Sundays was male. Why? Because it's talking about the father, and then the speaker says, second to the last line, what did I know? What did I know of love's lonely and austere offices? I didn't know then, I do know them. I do know now. It's like the speaker is identifying with the father in the poem. Could it be a mother? Sure. But the poem isn't about the speaker's mother. It's about the speaker's father, so to speak. Okay? So you have a series of questions to help formulate your thinking. Okay? Pages 611, cliches. You all know what a cliche is. Stock responses, predictable, conventional reactions to language. Like, for example, what's the stock response to something like dog's death? Sadness, depression, That's, sentimentality, exploiting those things about us that we all identify with. Turn to, nope, I can skip all of that. Writing about poetry, just very quickly. We're not doing any writing about poetry. But on 628, 629, you got a bunch of questions. These can help you understand, help you better appreciate the poems we're going to be reading if you at least have these in mind. Okay? Like, who's the speaker? Who's being spoken to? What's the subject? What's the topic? Is the speaker addressing anyone? Is there a specific setting of time and place? Well, those winter Sundays, there is at least the Sundays. Okay? Are there sounds repeated? I'm looking, just haphazardly through the things. All right? So now we'll get to some more important stuff. chapter 22, page 635. Word choice, word order, and tone. If you guys were writing papers for me, you would probably get your papers back and I would have written at some point on there WC, word choice. Why? Because sometimes you use a word that works, but there's a much better word that can be used instead. Well, word choice that is being talked about here is referring to the author's diction, the kinds of words that they pull from. We all have different kinds of diction. The kinds of words we use in here are probably not necessarily all the same kinds of words you use among your friends or when you're out on the field or in a bar. Okay? Why? Because we all wear, in one sense, different hats or different masks. When I was playing soccer, that was one mask. When I'm with my kids, that's another mask. When I'm at church, that's another mask. I don't say things at church that I often say in here. Okay? Swear a lot more here than I do, at church, so to speak. So, the choice of words. Well, you've got different kinds of diction. Page 636. Poetic diction, formal diction, middle diction, informal diction, colloquial speech, jargon. Be familiar with all of those, okay? Poetic diction, elevated language. Look, for example, in formal diction. Poetic diction and formal diction are often synonymous. Page 636, a passage from Thomas Hardy's The Convergence of the Twain. Just the title tells you this is poetic diction. This is not the kind of language people use in everyday speech. The Convergence of the Twain, by the way, the title is referring to the coming together, that's what convergence means, of the twain, the two. Iceberg, Titanic. So why didn't he just title it The Crash of the Titanic? So, in the solitude of the sea, deep from human vanity, in the pride of life that planned her, stilly couches she. Stilly couches she is talking about the Atlantic, the Titanic at the bottom of the Atlantic. She's lying there like on a couch. Okay? Middle diction, kind of language spoken by most educated people. Informal diction, that's what we tend to use on an everyday level. Or colloquial speech. Jargon. Depending on what your major is, you probably have jargon in your major. If you're a recording industry major, and you were to start talking to me about one of your classes, guess what? 99% of what you're talking about. Whoosh. Why? Because you're talking about specialized language for that discipline. Most of you probably have hated this course or have hated other English courses because the professors have used all of this language that you don't get because they've talked in what's called literary critical speak or theory speak, okay? Jargon is only useful around other people who will understand it. Dialect, however, top of 637, that's not the same. Dialect refers to the language spoken by a group of people that is centered in a particular area, like Southern dialect, versus New England. Bostonian comes down to here, you're going to tell immediately. Or someone from New Jersey comes down here, you're going to know immediately. Just as someone from Southern Alabama or Southern Georgia goes up to DC or New York and you stick out like a sore thumb. Also 637, denotations, connotations. We've been talking a lot about those throughout the entire semester. Denotation, literal dictionary definition meanings of words, like B-L-U-E. What's the literal dictionary definition of B-L-U-E? It's the color. Connotation, however, if I came in today and said, we're going to have a short class because I'm really blue today, it doesn't mean I'm a Smurf. It means I'm depressed. My dog died, kind of a thing. Okay? So connotations are all of those associations, implications, allusions that that word can refer to or suggest. And those are almost endless. That's one of the reasons poetry is harder to read. You've got to figure out what are the connotations. Look, for example, page 538. Little short poem by Randall Jarrell, written in 45. I don't know that he was, but he was probably in World War II. Title, Death of the Ball Turret Gunner. So what's a ball turret? B-17 bombers had two turrets. They had one down beneath the fuselage on the belly of the plane and another one on the top of the plane, like in between the wings on the top of the fuselage. And those things would rotate almost 360 degrees, okay, and go not quite 360, almost 180 the other direction. It was the most dangerous place to be in a B-17 because anti-aircraft fire, called flak, when those shells would explode, that shrapnel would rip right through the glass of the ball turret, more so than it would through the siding of a fuselage. From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state, and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. 6 miles from earth, loosed from its dream of life, I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. When I died, they washed me out of the turret with a hose. Now, you can't read that poem and apply strict literary dictionary definitions. Why? From my mother's sleep, I fell into the state. How do I fall from my mother's sleep? That doesn't work. It's connotations that are being talked to. And what the speaker is kind of emphasizing, you get a short paraphrase. After I was born, I what? Grew up to find myself at war. Or another paraphrase of that is, I was born into war. I was born, take that down even further, like I was born to die. Okay? I fell into the state and I hunched in its belly till my wet fur froze. What wet fur? Humans don't have fur. If you're in a B-17, you're flying 20, 30,000 feet. These things are not heated. So what do bomber crews wear? Bomber jackets that are leather on the outside, lined with fur on the... To get an original or real bomber jacket, they're thousands of dollars. Because they got to keep you warm at 30,000 feet, all right? Why is the wet fur freezing and why is the fur wet? Have you ever been in a tense situation? What do you tend to do when you're really tense? You sweat. The fur is wet from the bomber, from the gunner, sweating through his clothes into the fur. And the fur freezes because of the coldness of the air around. 6 miles from Earth, 25,000 feet, 30,000 feet, loosed from its dream of life. Why loosed from its dream of life? What does that mean? To be loosed from the dream of life. It's like, now I'm really awake. Everything down there, that was imaginary. Why? Because what's happening? Being shot at. It's said, there's nothing to really wake you up like a threat of death or a threat of immediately dying. It kind of makes you really focus on what's important. I woke to black flak. I woke from what? From the dream of life. It's like everything I'd experienced in my life until then, that was make-believe. I woke to black flak and the nightmare fighters. The German, if it's in Germany, the Messerschmitts coming at the bombers with speed and agility. When I died, they washed me. Well, notice there you have a problem. How can you speak if you're dead? They washed me out of the turret with a hose. Come in with a hose, clean all the gore and etc. out. So, 639. Notice the speaker, Randall Jarrell, uses a persona, a speaker created by the poet. In poems, the persona is the speaker. It's not a narrator. We don't use the term narrator in poetry. We use the term narrator for novels or short stories. All right? What else? Ambiguity at the bottom of that page. I've already talked about how ambiguity works, how it allows for multiple interpretations. Notice, however, just because it allows for multiple interpretations, it doesn't mean all interpretations are correct. You could not read that poem and say, it is about being visited by aliens. There's nothing in the short 5 lines of the poem to imply aliens. That is, the interpretation's got to be based on the words that are there in the particular work. Okay? Next page, tone. This one's often hard for students. It shouldn't be. Tone's the writer's attitude toward the subject, the mood created by that, all the elements. What's the mood of that, the death of a ball turret gunner? Is it sadness? Is there a bit of irony to it? Or what's the mood of dog's death? That's pretty clear. That's just sadness. All right? Those winter Sundays, meditative, reflective, a bit of sorrow, a bit of regret. But that's taking everything into a whole and trying to figure out what the attitude of the author is. Okay? Figures of speech. Nope, go back. Images, 669. We're going to come back to a poem in a moment. Images. You all know what images are and how imagery works. Okay? Notice, images. An image is language that addresses the senses. It doesn't have to be visual. Imagery is any language that is meant to excite or appeal to any of the 5 senses. Taste, touch, smell, sight, hearing. So there's a lot of poems, we're not going to read many of them, there's a lot of poems that are just designed to kind of tickle your ears by the use of rhyme and sounds. All right? Visual imagery is what we usually think of in terms of images or imagery. We think of crosses or crescents or the colors, flowers, sunrises, sunsets, okay? But that's not all that imagery is, okay? A lot of poems dealing with images. Figures of speech, 688. I'm just going through these terms quickly. Using one thing to say something else, okay? Figures of speech, page 688. Broadly defined as a way of saying one thing in terms of something else. What are the 2 most important ones? Simile, metaphor. Give me an example of a simile. They're both comparisons. Similes, however, you use words that are comparative. Dumb as a rock. Dead as a doornail. Okay? The as a is what makes the comparison. So you use like, and, as, etc. You've got some kind of indicator. Fast as a cheetah, eats like a pig, etc. Metaphor is where you say blank is blank. He's a pig. Doesn't mean someone literally has grown a snout and curly tail. Means they act like a pig. So Example the book uses, braid his approval. Well, bray is a verb that we apply to donkeys. Yeah, you know, that kind of thing. Well, braying your approval would be that. You're being compared to an ass or to a donkey. There's several other different kinds of figures of speech. Okay, 691. So on 690, you get simile and metaphor. 691, 3 different kinds of metaphors are referred to. You need to be familiar with all of these. You have an implied metaphor, okay? You have an extended metaphor and controlling metaphors. Now, we're going to read a controlling metaphor poem, so to speak. I don't think we'll get to it today. We'll get to it Thursday. By Anne Bradstreet, called The Author to Her Book. I think it's on the next page. Yep. And in that, the controlling metaphor is her writings, her book of poetry is like her children. She uses that metaphor all throughout. Individual poems are like an individual child. How she dresses that child, meaning how she arranges and constructs that poem, okay, it all follows that particular metaphor. We'll talk about that when we look at that poem again. Puns, you know what puns are. Play on words, implies having more meaning than is actually there. Apostrophe, page 696, is not what, you know, we think of the little thing you put before a possessive S. Apostrophe is a rhetorical figure of speech where you have someone speak, you have a persona speak like there is someone listening to it, okay? And address either to someone who is absent and therefore cannot hear the speaker, or to something not human that cannot comprehend it. So you have the example of someone speaking to a wasp. Understatement, think exaggeration or hyperbole, and the opposite. Okay? So the opposite of exaggeration, that's understatement. Great example of understatement is the Old English use of what's called litotes. Okay? Here's an example from an Old English poem. In this poem called The Dream of the Rood, we're told at one point that Jesus lay in his tomb with little company. How little company did Jesus have in the tomb? 0. Okay? That's extreme. It's little because the poet wants us to think of essentially the most little that you can get. All right? Paradox and oxymoron. Paradox, a statement that at first looks to be self-contradictory, but on closer inspection makes sense. Oxymoron, sweet sorrow that's given, silent scream, virgin maid or virgin mother. Okay? Figures of speech, symbol, allegory, and irony. Real quickly, everybody knows a symbol, something that represents something else. That's not quite right, okay? Because of the word represents. A symbol is something that is both itself and it points to something else. In other words, there's a famous phrase attributed to Freud. I don't think Freud actually ever said it, but you'll hear people say it. Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. Why? Because for Sigmund Freud, anything that was cylindrical, upright, or firm, or long is a penis. A cigar is all those things. But supposedly he said sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. It's not meant to point to something else. Symbols, they have to be read within the context. They don't automatically suggest something else. It's only if the context demands it. And so when we talk about that poem that's on that page, Acquainted with the Night, we'll talk about the symbolism of the moon, for example, or the night, or walking, when we get to that, okay? Conventional symbols, these are kinds of things that have been used for years. And by years, I mean hundreds and thousands of years. For example, you see something like this in a work of literature, a reference to a cross or the cross. It's both physically what it is and it points to. So, for example, harken back a long time ago to Midsummer Night's Dream. Gotta get my brain working, right? Hermia and Lysander are getting ready to start talking about going off to the woods. They talk about being star-crossed lovers and such. And Hermia makes a comment about things that cross us that are common, that is, it happens to everybody, we've got to learn to deal with. That word cross there can be both this kind of cross, a burden to be borne, a burden to be endured, and it can mean this kind of cross, like you have to go across, you have to be confronted by, okay? That's a conventional symbol. Literary or contextual symbols can be almost anything. Anything that both refers to itself and points to something else, like a color, white, a flower, a lily, a rose. What do roses usually symbolize? Love. Why? Because they're sold on Valentine's Day. Valentine's Day is not the best time of the year to buy roses. Why? Because they're not naturally blooming, here at least, during that period. Allegory can only be read one way. See, allegory does not allow for multiple interpretations. The greatest allegory in the English language, by many say, is a novel-like book written in the 17th century called Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan. Pilgrim's Progress is about the journey by a young man named Christian. He is going to the celestial city, okay? You can never read Pilgrim's Progress and substitute Muslim for Christian. Doesn't work. You can't put Jew for Christian. You can't put Hindu. You can't put anything else but Christian there. And the celestial city always and only ever refers to heaven. Can never stand for anything else. It won't work, right? That's how allegory works. Most people don't like reading allegory because in allegory, the author is telling you exactly what to think. And most of us don't like being told what to think, okay? Allegory, notice 713, especially lends itself to didactic poetry or didactic literature. All didactic means is teaching. Ancient Roman poet Horace said the purpose of literature was to teach and delight. Most didactic poetry or literature is all about that, not so much this. My major area is medieval literature. There's a ton of stuff written in the Middle Ages that no one reads today. Why? It's sermonizing. It's using literature solely to teach. This they didn't care about. Okay? If it's not delightful, most people aren't going to read it. So you got to kind of appeal to both. It's the thing Shakespeare does so well. He both teaches, there's a lot of meat in Shakespeare's plays, but he also has to appeal to a broad range in terms of audience. Irony. We all know what irony is. We all use it every day. Sarcasm is a form of irony. Okay? You've got a great ironic poem there, which we're going to read. Okay? Discrepancy between what is said and what is expected. Then you have two different kinds of irony, situational and verbal irony, which we talked about with drama, so I don't need to go over that again. Sounds and pattern of rhythms and poetic forms, we're going to go over later. So I'm going to back up to 6:45. I think that was it. Winter Sundays. No, we're going to back up. Yeah, 6:45. Robert Herrick. To the virgins to make much of time. Okay? So the author's alive in the late 16th, most of the 17th century. A little bit of background. The guy was an Anglican priest. So his job was to serve the sacraments, pastoral counseling, all that kind of stuff with his parish. How did I miss that? On this page, you have the term carpe diem, which is Latin for, it's two words, seize the day. If you ever saw Dead Poets Society with Robin Williams, 1987, 88, something like that, maybe 89, you couldn't, after watching that, you couldn't not know what this is. Because the character in that Robin Williams plays, a literature teacher at a prep school, emphasizes to his boys, it's a private boys' school, over and over, to seize the day. What does it mean, seize the day? It's this idea that you don't know how long you're going to live, so live as much as you can every day you're alive. It's kind of. Hamlet hints at it when he tells Horatio in Act 5, just before the fencing scene. He tells Horatio, he's got a bad feeling about this fencing match, and Horatio says, don't go through with it, follow your gut. He goes, no, I'm not going to. Why? If it's not today, it's tomorrow. If it's not tomorrow, it'll be today. If it's not going to be today, then it will come. And he's talking, the it is death. And he says, the readiness is all. What's his point? We have to be ready to die at every moment of every day. So, Carpe Diem says, get what you can now. Especially you, because you're all young. So this poem by Herrick, To the Virgins to Make Much of Time. The title, what does virgins refer to? Is that a sexed term? Is that women? Not necessarily. It means to those who are sexually virgin, whether male or female, to make much of time. That is, use your time. So, gather ye rosebuds while ye may, old time is still a-flying. And this same flower that smiles today, tomorrow will be dying. That is the theme of every Carpe Diem work. What is alive today will be dead tomorrow, which is why you have to grab what you can today. Okay? So, rosebuds, notice, not fully opened roses. Gather the buds today. Why? Because tomorrow they're going to be losing their petals. It's not literally true, obviously. Metaphorically, it is. The glorious lamp, another image, the glorious lamp of heaven, the sun, the higher he's a getting, the sooner will his race be run, and nearer he's to setting. So, talking about just a day, here's the east, here's the west, the sun rises. The higher he's to getting means what? The PM, the prime meridian. What's that referring to? The highest point in the sky that the sun reaches. Once it gets just past that, what is the sun doing? It's setting. Okay? Apply that idea of the sun rising and setting to our lives. You guys, assuming nothing happens to any of you, God forbid, you live long, healthy, happy lives, you guys are still over here. I'm about there in terms of the grand scheme of things. If I live another 20 years, actually I don't want to live another 20 years. I'll be happy if I'm dead by 80. I don't want to live into my 80s. Once I reach this point, whatever that midpoint is, the problem is we don't know what that midpoint is. Biblically, The Old Testament idea is 70 is the amount of life you have. And if you're lucky, the psalmist says 80, so 80. So midpoint, 35 to 40. Dante, great Italian writer who wrote the Divine Comedy, begins the Divine Comedy with saying, midway through my life's journey. Think of his life as a metaphor, as a journey. He writes it beginning, metaphorically, his 35th year. He didn't actually, I don't think he lived to be 70. So, the sun, the higher he's getting to what? The highest part, the closer he is to setting. His point is, if the sun gets up here and you haven't lived, you've wasted it. That age is best, which is the first, when youth and blood are warmer. But being spent, the worse and worse times still succeed the former. So, looking at this again, he's saying that age is best, which is the first. Your ages, let's say 20s. Because once that's spent, once you've gone past here and down, he says what? The worse and worse times still succeed the former. Once you reach that midpoint and go beyond, every day is worse than the day before. And every day after that, notice that's kind of a bleak attitude. Then be not coy. We'll talk about that word in just a moment. But use your time. And while you may, go marry. Notice M-A-R-R-Y, not M-E-R-R-Y. Most Americans today don't pronounce M-A-R-R-Y differently than M-E-R-R-Y. Okay? In Herbert's day, it was. Why? For having lost but once your prime, you may forever tarry. So what does it mean to be coy? That's a term that's usually, much more so in Herrick's day than today, because we don't use it today. That word is almost unknown in the English language today. It's used to apply to only one sex. Women. Women were said to be coy, or women could act coy. What does that mean? There's another phrase we use, playing hard to get. Okay? In other words, putting on an act of not liking someone, not wanting someone, but it is an act. In other words, it's all part of this socially constructed game, this socially constructed mating rituals, so to speak. Because it's thought, Western Christian culture and such, it's thought a woman who is too sexually overt is too easy. Will sleep with anyone. Okay? I mean, that very term, easy, implies that. So, be not coy, that is, let's not play games. I know what I want. I know what you want. But use your time, meaning use your youth. Enjoy yourself. And while you may, while you are able to, go marry. That is, get a ring. Why? Because once you lose your prime, you're going to be waiting forever. The carpe diem here, if it is towards women, I think it clearly is, he's saying, honey, if you don't use all of your youth and beauty and sexuality now, and you wait for Mr. Right, so to speak, and don't find him, you're going to be waiting forever. Now, if that's right, what's the speaker saying? Or what might the speaker be saying? And there's a huge difference between this and the next poem we're going to do. This is just generally advice to women, so to speak. The next poem, which I don't know that we'll get through, on the next page, Andrew Marvell to his coy mistress. Notice, the first one is to the virgins to make much of time. This is just a general blanket statement. This one to his coy mistress. So it's the speaker, the persona, addressing his girlfriend who is playing hard to get. Implication is they've not had sex. Had we but world enough and time, this coyness lady were no crime. What does the had we mean? We would throw in an if. If we had world enough and time, this coyness lady were no crime. What does the if imply? It's a conditional, right? If I had $1 million, fill in the blank. I wouldn't be here. If I won the lottery, the jackpot lotto, I wouldn't show up for work the next day. I probably would, just common decency. But it'd be end of the semester, it'd totally be it. His point is, we don't. It's called the subjunctive mood. It indicates a condition contrary to fact. So he's going to explain what they would do if we had all the time in the world. We could sit down. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long loves day. I don't know about you, but I remember being a little kid, middle of summer, friend over or something, and what do you want to do? I don't know, what do you? And you waste the whole freaking day not doing anything. You, by the Indian Ganges, the Ganges River in India, would sit and find rubies. He says, I would sit by the tide of Umber, this is the Umber River in northern England, and would complain. He doesn't mean I'd sit there and bellyache and moan. Complain means he would write a love poem about her. I would love you 10 years before the flood. Notice the flood is capitalized. That's Noah's flood. Genesis, 6? I would love you 10 years before that. And you could refuse me, if you please, if you wanted to, till when? Till the conversion of the Jews. What does that mean? Protestant theology? That's the end of time. It's when Jesus returns. So we would love each other from 10 years before Noah's flood to the return of Jesus. Why? If we had world enough in time, what's the problem? My vegetable love should grow faster than empires and more slow. All he means by that, by vegetable, is slow growing. I would praise you. He says, 100 years should go to praise your eyes. So, 100 years for her eyes. And on thy forehead gaze. I think that's 100 for both the eyes and forehead. 200 to adore each breast. Assuming she's built normally, that's 400 years for her breasts. Okay, so 100, 400. But 30,000 to the rest. What's he mean, to the rest? Notice what he's doing. He's cataloging her. He's mapping her body. Where's he started? Forehead, eyes, breasts. He's moving south. What he really wants is the rest. An age at least to every part, the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower. And that next word kind of undercuts. Lower rate. What's meant by rate? You know, there's a joke. Kind of a joke. Thing, you know. Guy asks a woman, I'll pay you $100 to sleep with me. No, never would do that. I'll pay you $1,000. No. 10,000, 100,000, $1 million, 2 million. Okay, right. Now we're going to start haggling because now I know that you can be bought. I'm going to, get the price down. What's the point? Sex becomes economic. He's just reduced her to literally a commodity. But at my back, I always hear time's winged chariot drawing near. Why is time's winged chariot at his back? It's chasing him towards death. And yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Why is eternity portrayed as a desert? Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. What's her marble vault? Her burial tomb, her mausoleum, where the body is put. He says, when you're dead and buried, my song, my complaint, will not be sung around you. Then, when you're in your tomb, worms shall try, sorry, very disgusting imagery here, worms shall try that long preserved virginity. What does it mean, try? It means to prove. Well, how do you prove a woman's virginity? You got to spread her legs and see. The worms, he says, are going to go in and out of where you wouldn't let me. That is foul. It's carpe diem, though, because what's he telling her? Use it now with me, or you're not going to get anyone but worms. Right? I mean, what's Hamlet's talking about in Act 5? We all become food for worms. And your quaint honor turned to dust. Her quaint honor. Why does he refer to her honor? Because that's why she's not sleeping with him. And into ashes all my lust. The graves are fine in private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Notice the supposition or the assumption that the speaker is making about the woman being addressed, the coy mistress. If she doesn't sleep with the speaker, what's going to happen? She's not going to sleep with any man. What might the problem be? He doesn't attract her. Okay? All right, we'll stop there since it's 11:05. Don't forget the exam due Friday, I think it is. Remember, there are some passages to ID. They are major passages we spent time discussing. They're not a couple of lines, that kind of thing. Think major characters, Theseus, Hippolyta, Hamlet, the king, the queen, Oedipus, Antigone, etc. All right,